6 months after his wife gave birth, David Miller believed the worst was behind him: the sleepless nights, the quiet arguments, the weight that settles into a home when love is stretched thin. Then his phone vibrated at 11:47 p.m. One message. One line from the last person he ever expected. "We need to talk. It's urgent." That single sentence cracked open a reality David didn't know he was living in. A reality where silence had protected the wrong people. Where the woman everyone pitied was hiding a pain no one bothered to see. Where injustice didn't scream, it waited patiently. What followed wasn't just a conversation. It was the first step into a truth buried under loyalty fear, and a betrayal so carefully disguised it almost looked like love. And once the truth surfaced, nothing, especially this family, would ever be the same again. Before we dive into this story, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're drawn to deep emotional stories about truth, betrayal, and healing, don't forget to subscribe, because this is only the beginning. 6 months after his wife gave birth, David Miller thought he understood exhaustion. He thought he understood sacrifice. He thought he understood what it meant to hold a family together when everything inside you felt like it was quietly coming apart. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the moment his phone vibrated on the kitchen counter at 11:47 p.m., lighting up the dark room like a warning flare. One message, one sender, 7 words that didn't belong to an ordinary night. "We need to talk. It's urgent." It came from a man David had trusted for years, a man who had stood beside him at his wedding, a man who had held his newborn son and smiled as if everything was exactly the way it should be. And yet in that moment, the message felt less like concern and more like a confession waiting to happen. David stood there in silence, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant sound of his baby breathing through the monitor upstairs. The house looked peaceful, almost fragile, like a glass structure that only stayed standing because no one dared to touch it. 6 months earlier, everyone had told him he was lucky. A healthy baby, a wife who survived a difficult birth, a home that looked intact from the outside. But luck is often what people call a story when they don't want to look too closely at the cracks forming underneath. Because what no one talked about, what no one wanted to admit, was how unfair those 6 months had really been. They didn't see the way his wife's smile stopped reaching her eyes. They didn't see how conversations turned into silence, and silence turned into walls. They didn't see how David learned to carry guilt. He didn't understand blame he never earned, and fear he couldn't name. And now suddenly someone else had decided that the truth could no longer stay buried. The injustice of it hit him all at once. Why now? Why after the baby? Why after he had already given everything he had left? David didn't reply immediately. His fingers hovered over the screen as his mind raced through every possible explanation and rejected every comforting one. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't about a small misunderstanding. This wasn't about concern or friendly advice. This was about something that had been hidden on purpose. Some truths don't explode into your life. They seep in quietly. They wait until you're tired, until you're vulnerable, until you're holding something you love so much that losing it would destroy you. And that's when they strike. What David didn't know yet, what he couldn't have known, was that this conversation would force him to question everything. His marriage, his loyalty, his past decisions, and the people he had trusted without hesitation. It would blur the line between victim and villain. It would reveal how easily silence can become a weapon. And it would expose a kind of betrayal that doesn't always look like cheating. but leaves deeper scars than most people ever recover from. This wasn't just a story about a marriage under pressure. It was a story about how truth waits patiently while lies feel comfortable. About how injustice thrives when good people choose not to ask hard questions. About how sometimes the most dangerous betrayals come disguised as help. And once the first secret surfaced, there would be no way to put it back. Before we step into the full story, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Right now, I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're drawn to emotional cinematic stories about betrayal, truth, and healing, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty, love, and forgiveness. By morning, the message still hadn't been answered. David Miller woke before the alarm, his body trained by months of broken sleep and quiet emergencies. The pale, gray light, slipping through the curtains, felt colder than usual, as if the house itself hadn't fully woken yet. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the distant traffic outside, to the faint creak of the floorboards, as the house settled to the steady, fragile rhythm of his son's breathing through the baby monitor on the nightstand. That sound anchored him. It always did. Noah, 6 months old, small hands, soft skin that smelled like milk and warmth. A life that had arrived screaming and red-faced, demanding everything and giving nothing back, yet somehow becoming the center of David's universe overnight. David rolled onto his side and stared at the ceiling, letting the weight of responsibility press down on his chest. He told himself the same thing he'd been repeating for months now. Just get through today. Down the hall, the bedroom door creaked open. Rachel moved quietly, as she always did now, careful not to wake the baby, or maybe careful not to wake him. David couldn't tell anymore. There was a time when they had shared mornings in silence that felt intimate. Coffee brewing, soft smiles, a hand on his shoulder as she passed behind him. That silence had changed. Now it felt like distance measured in inches and unsaid words. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled into a loose knot, her eyes already tired despite the early hour. She glanced at David, then away, as if looking at him required more energy than she had to give. "I'll get him," she said, softly gesturing toward the monitor before David could move. He nodded. "Okay." She disappeared down the hall, her footsteps barely audible. David sat up slowly, running a hand over his face. The mirror on the closet door reflected a man he barely recognized. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders tense even at rest, the quiet heaviness of someone who had learned to function on empty. This was supposed to be the good part. That was what everyone said. Friends, family, co-workers who patted his back and told him he was doing great. They saw photos, birthday posts, a smiling couple holding a baby wrapped in soft blue blankets. From the outside, David Miller's life looked stable, complete. Inside, it felt like he was constantly bracing for something to collapse. In the kitchen, he poured coffee he barely tasted. His phone sat on the counter face down, exactly where he'd left it the night before. He hadn't checked it since, hadn't needed to. The message was burned into his memory. "We need to talk. It's urgent. Andrew Collins." The name alone stirred a mix of comfort and unease. Andrew had been part of David's life for nearly 15 years. College roommate. Best man. The person who knew his worst habits and his biggest fears, and who had never, until now, crossed a line like calling this late with words that heavy. Andrew wasn't dramatic. He wasn't impulsive. He didn't exaggerate. If Andrew said it was urgent, it meant something was wrong. David took a slow sip of coffee, then another, as if the routine might ground him. Upstairs, Noah began to fuss, a soft whimper that grew louder. Rachel's voice followed, gentle, practiced, steady. She always sounded calm with the baby. That was part of what confused David the most. Rachel loved Noah. Of that he had no doubt. But love didn't explain the way she'd changed. She used to talk about everything. Her fears, her thoughts, her plans for the future. Now, conversation stalled after a few sentences. When David asked how she was feeling, she answered with vague reassurances. Fine, tired, just adjusting. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe her. Because the alternative meant something else was happening beneath the surface. Something she wasn't ready or willing to share. Rachel came downstairs with Noah in her arms. The baby's face was flushed from sleep, his tiny fist wrapped around the fabric of her shirt. David watched her closely, searching for signs he couldn't define. Her posture was slightly hunched, as if she were carrying more than just the child. Her eyes flicked toward him again, then away. You didn't sleep much, she said. Neither had she. He could hear it in her voice. Did you? He asked. She shrugged, bouncing Noah gently. Same as usual. That answer felt practiced, rehearsed. David nodded and said nothing more. He didn't trust himself to push, not yet. Not with the echo of Andrew's message still ringing in his head. They ate breakfast in near silence. Rachel fed Noah small spoonfuls, wiping his chin with careful precision. David watched the way her hands trembled just slightly, a detail most people would miss. He noticed everything now. Or at least, he felt like he was trying to. After breakfast, Rachel gathered her things. I'm taking Noah to my mom's today, she said, avoiding his eyes. Just for a few hours. David's stomach tightened. You didn't mention that last night. I decided this morning. Another practiced line. Okay, he said slowly. That's fine. She hesitated as if she wanted to say something more. For a brief second, David saw the flicker of conflict behind her eyes. Then it was gone. I'll text you later, she said, and left before he could respond. The door closed softly behind her. David stood alone in the kitchen, the quiet, suddenly oppressive. He looked at his phone again, this time picking it up. No new messages, no clarification. Just that one line, sitting there like a loaded question. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed his unease. Blamed stress, blamed exhaustion, blamed the adjustment period everyone warned him about. But now something felt different. This wasn't just about sleepless nights or emotional distance. This felt like the beginning of something he hadn't been prepared for, a truth waiting to be spoken, whether he was ready or not. David didn't know it yet, but the calm of that morning was the last moment of ignorance he would have for a long time. The quiet life he'd been clinging to, fragile, imperfect, but familiar, was already slipping away. And when Andrew finally spoke, it would force David to see that the storm hadn't passed at all. It had only been waiting. Andrew Collins had never been the kind of man who called without a reason. That thought followed David Miller all morning, like a shadow he couldn't shake. At work, he stared at blueprints without seeing them, his pen hovering uselessly above paper. Conversations drifted past him, muffled and distant, as if he were underwater. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked back to his phone, half expecting another message to appear. Nothing came. By noon, the silence had grown louder than the message itself. David finally typed back a short reply. When the response came less than a minute later. Tonight, after work, same place, same place. The words tightened something in David's chest. The place Andrew meant was a small coffee shop on the edge of downtown, tucked between an old bookstore and almost a closed-down theater. It was where they had met countless times over the years, after exams, after breakups, after bad decisions they didn't want anyone else to know about. Neutral ground. Familiar. Safe. Or at least it used to be. The rest of the day crawled by. David left work early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie. By the time he pulled into the coffee shop's parking lot, the sun was already sinking low, staining the sky with muted shades of orange and gray. The building looked the same as it always had. Faded brick flickering sign windows fogged by the warmth inside. Andrew's car was already there. David sat in his own car for a moment longer than necessary, gripping the steering wheel. He felt the familiar urge to rehearse, to imagine every possible version of what Andrew might say, so none of them could surprise him. But his mind kept circling back to the same conclusion. If this were something small, Andrew would have said it already. Inside the shop was nearly empty. Soft music hummed from hidden speakers. The smell of coffee and burnt sugar hung in the air. Andrew sat at a corner table, his back to the wall, hands wrapped around a cup he hadn't touched. He looked different. Not older exactly, but heavier. His shoulders were tense, his posture stiff. When he looked up and saw David, relief flickered across his face, quickly followed by something else. Guilt. David noticed that too. "Hey," David said, sliding into the chair across from him. Andrew nodded. "Hey." An awkward silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. The kind of silence that presses down on your ears, daring someone to break it first. So David said finally, "You sounded serious." Andrew exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for hours. "Yeah, I didn't know how else to say it." David leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "You scared the hell out of me, man. You don't call like that unless something's wrong." Andrew's jaw tightened. He glanced around the room, then back at David. "What I'm about to tell you, it can't leave this table. Not yet." David frowned. "Andrew, you're not making this easier." "I know," Andrew said quickly. "I know. I just—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "I've been sitting on this for months, and it's eaten me alive. Months." The word echoed in David's head. Months of what David asked. Andrew hesitated. His eyes dropped to the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "Of knowing something that changes everything you think you understand about your life." David felt a chill creep up his spine. About what Andrew looked up then, meeting David's eyes directly for the first time since he'd arrived. There was no exaggeration there. No drama. Just fear. About Rachel, Andrew said. And about what happened before Noah was born. The name hit harder than David expected. He stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Andrew swallowed. "What you believe happened isn't the whole story." David's heart began to pound. "That's a pretty vague thing to drop on someone." "I know. And I'm sorry." Andrew leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But I need you to listen to me without jumping to conclusions. Please." David's mind raced. Every defensive instinct kicked in at once. If this is about rumors or assumptions, it's not. Andrew interrupted a little too quickly. "It's about things I've seen. Things I should have said something about sooner." David stared at him, anger flaring now, sharp and sudden. "Seen what?" Andrew hesitated again, clearly struggling. "I don't think Rachel betrayed you, in the way you're probably imagining." David blinked. That wasn't what he'd expected. "Then what are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying," Andrew replied carefully, "that there was someone else involved. Someone who never should have been." David leaned back in his chair, his chest tight. "Involved how?" Andrew shook his head. "Not like that. Not physically. At least, not in the way you're thinking." "That's not reassuring," David said flatly. "I know," Andrew said. "But hear me out. Rachel was vulnerable, pregnant, isolated. And there was someone who took advantage of that." David felt his jaw clench. Who? Andrew looked away. I don't want to say the name yet. That's not how this works, David snapped. You don't drag me here, drop half a bomb, and then hold back. Andrew flinched. I'm not trying to protect him. I'm trying to protect you and Rachel. From what David demanded. From the wrong assumptions, Andrew said quietly. From blaming the wrong person. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're asking me to stay calm while you imply something happened with my wife that I don't know about. I'm asking you to stay open, Andrew replied. Because if you confront her the wrong way, it could do more damage than you realize. David stared at him, disbelief and anger swirling together. You've known about this for months, he said slowly. And you're only telling me now. Andrew's face fell. That's the part I'll never forgive myself for. Why, David asked. Why wait? Because I was afraid, Andrew admitted. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of destroying your family. Afraid of what it would mean if I spoke up. David stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. This is insane, David Andrews said urgently. Please, sit down. I have proof. That stopped him. Proof. David's hands trembled slightly as he sank back into the chair. What kind of proof? Andrew reached into his bag, fingers shaking as he pulled out his phone. Messages, appointment records, things that don't make sense until you put them together. David's pulse roared in his ears. And you're just holding on to all this. I didn't know what else to do, Andrew said. But I can't stay silent anymore. Not after everything. David stared at the phone in Andrew's hand, feeling the ground shift beneath him. You're telling me my life is built on something I don't understand. I'm telling you, Andrew said softly, that the truth is more complicated than betrayal, and a lot more dangerous than you think. The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Whatever Andrew was about to show him, David knew one thing for certain. There was no going back to the life he'd known before this conversation. David didn't touch the phone right away. It sat on the table between them like a foreign object, small, ordinary, and yet capable of tearing his life open if he let it. Andrew's hand hovered nearby, tense, as if he might pull it back at any moment. The coffee shop felt suddenly too quiet, the low hum of the espresso machine doing nothing to mask the pounding in David's ears. You're asking me to look at this, David said slowly, and believe that what I see is worse than what I'm already imagining. Andrew nodded once. Yes. David let out a breath through his nose. That's a hell of a gamble. It is, Andrew said, but it's the truth. David reached for the phone. The first thing he saw was a string of appointment confirmations, dates, times, locations, therapy sessions, prenatal consultations, postpartum follow-ups. At first glance, nothing looked out of place. Rachel had struggled during the pregnancy. Anxiety, sleeplessness, emotional swings that doctors had chalked up to hormones and stress. But then David noticed the pattern. The appointments weren't always at the clinic listed on their insurance. Some were marked as private. Others were scheduled outside normal hours. And threaded between them were messages, long blocks of text that made his stomach tighten as he scrolled. They weren't flirtatious. They weren't romantic. They were intimate in a way that felt worse. I don't feel safe in my own head, one message read. You're the only one who understands, read another. Please don't tell my husband yet. He wouldn't get it. David's fingers stiffened. Who is this? He asked, though part of him already knew. Andrew swallowed. Dr. Benjamin Carter. The name landed hard. David leaned back, his chest constricting. Her therapist, yes, Andrew said. The one she started seeing during the pregnancy. The one she kept seeing after. David shook his head slowly. That doesn't mean anything. People text their therapists sometimes. Not like this, Andrew said quietly. David kept reading. The messages weren't overt, but they crossed lines David hadn't even known existed. Carter's replies were reassuring, calming, carefully worded. He validated Rachel's fears, her doubts, her sense of isolation. And slowly, subtly, he positioned himself as the only person she could trust. You don't need to carry this alone. Sometimes partners don't know how to show up the way we need. Your feelings make sense. Don't let anyone minimize them. David's throat tightened. How did you get this? He asked. Andrew looked away. I didn't steal it. Rachel showed me by accident, months ago. She was spiraling. She handed me her phone, asked me to read something she didn't know how to explain. And you didn't tell me, David said. Andrew flinched. I told her she needed to talk to you. She begged me not to. Said you were already overwhelmed. That she didn't want to be another burden. David closed his eyes. That sounded exactly like Rachel. She trusted you, David said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. Yes, Andrew said. And I failed both of you. David set the phone down slowly. His hands felt numb. So what are you saying, he asked. That he manipulated her? Yes, Andrew said without hesitation. And I think it started before Noah was born. David's heart began a race again. That's a serious accusation. I know, Andrew said. But look at the timing, the dependency, the way he discouraged her from leaning on you. That's not therapy, that's control. David stared at the table, memories rising uninvited. Rachel withdrawing, her sudden reluctance to talk about sessions, the way she'd say things like, you wouldn't understand, or it's complicated. He'd assumed it was postpartum depression, stress, something he could fix by being patient. He'd never considered the possibility that someone else had been quietly shaping her reality. Why tell me now, David asked. Andrew's voice dropped. Because last week I saw Carter with another patient, a woman who looked just as lost as Rachel did back then. And I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. David felt a flash of anger, sharp and hot. So what do you want me to do? I want you to be careful, Andrew said. And I want you to understand something before you confront her. David looked up, but Andrew hesitated. I don't think Rachel sees herself as a victim. That stopped him. What do you mean, I think, Andrew said slowly, that Carter made her believe she chose this, that she needed him, that what he was doing was helping her survive. David clenched his fists, and the baby Andrew met his eyes. I don't know. The words echoed in the space between them. I haven't seen anything that suggests physical infidelity, Andrew added quickly. No evidence of that. But emotional dependency can be just as destructive. And sometimes it leads places no one intends. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He felt dizzy, unsteady. I need air. Andrew followed him outside, the evening chill hitting them both. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. David, Andrew said, I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm telling you what I've seen. And I'm telling you because I can't carry this anymore. David paced a few steps, running a hand through his hair. You're asking me to question my wife's integrity, my child's origin, my own judgment. I'm asking you to question the man who had power over her when she was most vulnerable, Andrew replied. David stopped, turning back toward him. And if you're wrong, Andrew's voice broke, then I'll live with that. But if I'm right and you do nothing, then this continues. And Rachel stays trapped. David stared at the ground, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Rage, fear, guilt, love. He thought of Rachel's trembling hands, her distant eyes, the way she flinched when he touched her unexpectedly. Did he ever meet her alone? David asked. Andrew nodded, often. That was the final blow. David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. I won't confront her tonight. Andrew looked relieved. That's good. But I will start paying attention, David continued. To everything, Andrew nodded. That's all I hope for. David pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at the screen. His life felt suddenly unfamiliar, like he'd stepped into a version of reality that ran parallel to the one he'd been living in, close enough to touch, but fundamentally different. Whatever this is, David said quietly, it ends. Andrew placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm here. For whatever you need. David didn't respond. He wasn't sure what he needed anymore. As he drove home later that night, the house lights glowing softly in the distance, David felt the weight of knowledge settle into his chest. The truth hadn't exploded. It hadn't screamed. It had arrived calmly, methodically, rewriting everything he thought he knew. And he knew with chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The courtroom that morning was so quiet that every breath felt amplified. Cold white light poured down from the ceiling, reflecting off polished wood and glass, illuminating the faces of those present attorneys, journalists, shareholders, and those who once believed they would walk away victorious. She sat upright, her hands resting calmly on the table. No extravagant jewelry, no dramatic makeup, no armor. Her composure was not an act. It was the result of months of preparation, every document verified, every step calculated, every outcome anticipated. Across from her, the man who had once been her husband avoided eye contact. His fingers trembled slightly. The moment he saw a thick stack of files placed before her legal team, he knew this was no longer a divorce hearing. This was a reckoning. The judge entered. The room rose. The trial began. Her attorney stood first. His voice was steady, unhurried, almost restrained. He did not appeal to emotion. He relied on facts. He laid out a detailed timeline of covert share transfers. Over the past 3 years, Shell Company's intermediary accounts, silent partners. Transactions executed quietly, deliberately. Signatures bearing her name, forged while she was pregnant, while she was under medical care, while she was not even in the same country. The screen behind him lit up. Dates, times, locations, each detail locked into place with clinical precision. Then came the internal communications emails, encrypted messages, audio recordings from private meetings. In them, her former husband and his partners spoke freely about waiting until she signs about removing her from the company, about using the media if she resists. A ripple moved through the courtroom. The opposing counsel objected, but his voice lacked conviction. Every piece of evidence had been independently authenticated. There were no gaps, no doubts. And then came the moment that silenced the room completely. She stood. No one had asked her to. The judge gave a slight nod. She did not speak of betrayal. She did not recount humiliation or sleepless nights. She spoke only of ownership. She explained that the company's core technology, responsible for over 60% of its revenue, was built upon patents registered in her name long before the marriage. Patents that had never been legally transferred. Throughout the marriage, she had allowed the company to use her intellectual property based on verbal agreements and trust. Her voice did not waver. But trust, she said calmly, is not a substitute for law. Her attorney placed one final document on the table. The prenuptial agreement, Clause 17. A clause no one had taken seriously because no one believed she would ever enforce it. The clause stated that in the event of deception, infidelity, or intentional misappropriation of intellectual property, all financial control related to those assets would automatically revert to her without the need for further litigation. The judge read in silence for a long time. Then he looked up and struck the gavel. The ruling was final. The marriage was dissolved immediately. No mediation, no delay. All shares held by the former husband in entities connected to the technology platform were frozen and transferred back to her. Transactions from the past 3 years were referred for criminal investigation, forgery, financial fraud, defamation. Her former husband sank back into his chair. No one looked at him anymore. The hearing ended without applause, without drama. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Microphones crowded forward. Questions overlapped. She offered only one sentence. "I didn't defeat anyone," she said. "I simply reclaimed what was mine." Weeks later, an emergency shareholders meeting was convened. She took the stage as the sole legal owner and controlling authority. There were no whispers now. No skepticism. Only attention. Those who had once dismissed her bowed their heads. Those who had underestimated her reached out to shake her hand. She did not seek revenge. She restructured. Loyal executives were retained. Those complicit in the scheme were dismissed before the day ended. A transparent governance framework was announced. An independent oversight board was established. The company recovered faster than analysts predicted. And her former husband, he lost his executive authority. His reputation, the relationships built on borrowed power, collapsed overnight. The same media he once used to discredit her turned away without hesitation. One afternoon, she stood alone in her new office, looking out over the city. The skyline stretched endlessly beneath the glass, bright and alive, but it no longer overwhelmed her. She thought of the woman she once was, the woman who endured in silence, who was underestimated because she chose loyalty, because she believed love required patience. She did not despise that woman. She honored her. Without those moments of isolation, she would never have learned how to stand unshaken in the open. She picked up her phone and deleted the final number tied to her past. No message, no explanation, just an ending. Outside, life moved forward. New ventures, new decisions, relationships chosen with clarity, not fear. She no longer needed to prove her strength. Her presence here now was proof enough. The world did not end after the verdict. It didn't even pause. Traffic continued to crawl through intersections. Emails kept arriving. Coffee cooled in untouched mugs. That was the strangest part, how ordinary everything looked after something so monumental had finally collapsed. For the first time in years, she woke up without a knot in her chest. Morning light filtered through the curtains of the apartment she had moved into only weeks earlier. It wasn't large or extravagant. No sweeping views, no dramatic architecture, just clean lines, warm tones, and silence that didn't feel heavy. Silence that felt earned. She lay there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the city breathe beyond the glass. No phone vibrating with demands. No schedule built around someone else's expectations. No need to brace herself. When she stood, the mirror reflected someone unfamiliar, but not in a frightening way. Her eyes were clearer, her posture relaxed. The woman staring back looked like someone who had finally stepped out of a long shadow. At the office, the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversation stopped when she entered, not out of fear but respect. The kind that comes when people realize power no longer flows through manipulation or inherited titles, but through legitimacy, through competence. Meetings were efficient now, transparent. Disagreements were voiced openly without whispering alliances forming in the corners of conference rooms. She encouraged it. She wanted friction where ideas met, honestly, not secrets festering in silence. Yet despite the success, the promotions, the glowing press coverage that framed her as a symbol of resilience and intelligence, she felt something unexpected. Emptiness. Not the hollow ache she once carried, but a quieter absence. A space where rage used to live. Where adrenaline had fueled her every decision. The fight was over. And now she had to learn who she was without it. One afternoon, she received a message from an unfamiliar number. No greeting, just a request. Can we talk? I know I don't deserve it. She stared at the screen longer than she should have. She knew who it was without asking. The phrasing was unmistakable, always asking, never taking responsibility. She typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. In the end, she turned the phone face down and walked away. Some conversations are not meant to bring closure. Some doors are meant to remain closed, not out of bitterness, but self-preservation. That evening, she met an old friend for dinner. Someone who had known her before the marriage, before the compromises, before the slow erosion of her confidence. They talked about trivial things at first: travel plans, movies, a restaurant that had quietly become the best in the city. Laughter came easily without effort. Then, inevitably, the question surfaced. How are you really doing? She considered lying. The polished version of herself could have answered effortlessly, but she chose honesty. I'm learning, she said slowly, how to exist without apologizing for taking up space. Her friend nodded. No advice, no platitudes, just understanding. That night, she walked home alone, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The city lights reflected in puddles left behind by an earlier rain. She caught her reflection again, fragmented, glowing, moving forward. For the first time, the past did not chase her. Weeks passed, then months. She declined several public speaking offers, accepted a few that mattered, mentored quietly, invested thoughtfully, chose rest without guilt. And slowly, something inside her softened. One morning, she visited the old house, the one she'd left behind. It was empty now, stripped of furniture, echoing. Sunlight poured through windows that once framed arguments and forced smiles. She walked through each room without touching anything. No tears, no anger. Just memory acknowledged and released. In the bedroom, she paused. This was where she had felt smallest, where she had questioned her worth in the dark, convincing herself endurance was the same as love. She exhaled. Never again, she whispered, not as a vow fueled by pain, but as a promise grounded in clarity. As she turned to leave, she felt lighter. Not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer defined her. Outside, the air was crisp, clean. Life was not waiting for her permission to move on. It already had. That night, she wrote in a journal for the first time in years. Not to document strategies or track progress, but to reflect. She wrote about trust, about how easily it can be weaponized, about how strength does not always roar. It often whispers enough before anyone else hears it. She wrote about the danger of staying silent for the sake of harmony, about how love without respect becomes a cage. And finally, she wrote about forgiveness, not for those who betrayed her, but for herself, for not leaving sooner, for doubting her instincts, for believing that patience could substitute boundaries. She closed the journal and placed it in a drawer, not as a record of pain, but as proof of survival. Outside, the city hummed. Somewhere, a siren wailed briefly, then faded, life in motion, unconcerned with her personal victories. And she smiled. Because for the first time, she didn't need the world to acknowledge what she had overcome. She knew And that was enough. It happened on a Tuesday, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of day that rarely announces change. She was reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant hesitated at the door. Not nervous, not rushed, just cautious. "There's a man here to see you," she said. "He says his name is David Miller." The name landed heavier than it should have. For a moment the room felt smaller. David Miller was not part of her present. He belonged to a chapter long sealed, folded into the years before ambition sharpened into survival. Before marriage taught her how quietly power could be stolen. Before betrayal rewrote the meaning of trust. She hadn't heard his name spoken aloud in nearly a decade. "What does he want?" she asked calmly, though her pulse betrayed her. "He says it's personal and that it's urgent." That word again, urgent. The universe had a cruel sense of symmetry. She considered saying no. Considered letting time continue doing what it did best, moving forward without explanation. But something in her chest tightened, not with fear, but with curiosity sharpened by instinct. 10 minutes, she said. In the conference room, David Miller stood when she entered. He looked older than she remembered. Not dramatically, just enough that life had clearly pressed its weight into the lines around his eyes. His posture was careful, as though he were stepping onto ground he wasn't sure would hold him. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. She nodded once and sat opposite him, placing her tablet on the table, like a quiet barrier. "You have 10 minutes, she replied. "Please use them wisely." David exhaled, not relieved, resigned. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "I didn't come here to revisit the past. I came because something I should have said years ago is now dangerous not to say." Her fingers stilled. He explained slowly, choosing words with deliberate restraint. Years ago, before her marriage, before the company's rise, David had worked briefly with one of the financial consultants later implicated in the fraud case. At the time, nothing had seemed criminal, just off. Unusual transfers, clients who disappeared, files sealed without reason. "I didn't have proof," he said, "and I didn't have the courage to push. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility." She watched him closely, noting the absence of self-pity. This wasn't a confession seeking absolution. It was an offering of truth, late but intentional. "When your case went public," David continued, "I recognized patterns, names, methods. And then I saw who was quietly funding the shell entities connected to your ex-husband." He slid a folder across the table. Her attorney instincts ignited instantly. Inside were names she hadn't seen before. Entities buried beneath layers of distance. A silent investor whose identity had been intentionally obscured. She looked up. "Why bring this to me now?" she asked. "Because the man behind it," David said quietly, "isn't finished. He's repositioning. And if he succeeds, your company won't be the last target." The clock ticked softly on the wall. Her mind moved quickly, not emotionally, but strategically. This wasn't about reopening wounds. This was about prevention. "Why not go to the authorities?" she asked. "I am," David replied. "But you deserve to know first." And because he paused, then met her gaze. "You were the only person I knew who wouldn't ignore this." Silence settled between them, not awkward, but weighted. She realized something then. This meeting wasn't a threat to her healing. It was proof of it. She was no longer someone the past could ambush. "Thank you," she said finally, "for bringing this to me. And for not asking anything in return." David nodded, standing slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just didn't want silence to be my legacy." As he left, she didn't watch him go. She was already opening the folder again, marking pages, connecting threads. By evening, her legal team was assembled. Analysts joined remotely. A quiet investigation began, not reactive but proactive. They moved without press, without announcements, precision over noise. Over the next weeks, she uncovered something chilling, a network designed not to steal outright, but to destabilize. Companies pushed into scandal, leadership discredited, assets absorbed quietly. Her case had not been an exception. It had been a test run. This time, she was ready. Instead of confrontation, she chose exposure. Regulators were briefed with airtight documentation. Journalists received verified leads simultaneously. Financial watchdogs initiated audits before defenses could be raised. The collapse was swift. The silent investor's empire unraveled not through courtrooms, but through daylight. Transparency proved more lethal than accusation. And when the dust settled, she remained standing unscathed. One evening, weeks later, she received a message from David. "It's done. Thank you for." She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, watching the city flicker alive beneath her. Somewhere out there, people were still choosing silence over discomfort, still mistaking endurance for virtue. She typed a single response. "Thank you for choosing truth." Nothing more was needed. As she turned away from the glass, she felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Not closure, continuity. Her life was no longer a series of reactions. It was a deliberate trajectory, guided by clarity, reinforced by boundaries, and strengthened by the knowledge that even delayed honesty could still matter. The storm had passed, but she had learned how to read the sky, and she would never be caught unprepared again. The first anonymous envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped beneath the glass door of her office before dawn. No return address, no markings, just wait. She didn't open it immediately. Experience had taught her that urgency was often a trap designed to pull emotion ahead of judgment. Instead, she placed it in her drawer, locked it, and continued her morning meetings as planned. Revenue forecasts, compliance updates, a new mentorship initiative she had quietly approved without press. Only when the building grew quieter did she retrieve the envelope again. Inside were photocopies, old, yellowed at the edges, medical billing records, travel receipts, a grainy photograph of a woman leaving a private clinic, her face half turned toward the camera. The date stopped her breath. 6 months after the birth. Her mind did not race. It sharpened. The documents were not random. They were curated, intentional, and they pointed toward a truth that had been intentionally concealed during the most vulnerable period of her life. She called her legal counsel immediately, followed by a private investigator she trusted implicitly. No questions, no speculation, just instructions. Verify everything she said. Quietly. That night, she didn't sleep. Not from fear, but from the familiar sensation of a pattern emerging. The same cold recognition she had felt months earlier, when betrayal first revealed itself, not through confession, but through inconsistencies. By Monday, confirmation arrived. The woman in the photograph had been admitted under an alias, paid in cash. The attending physician had since retired abruptly. The clinic had changed ownership twice. But the timing was undeniable. Her former husband had not been where he claimed to be during those weeks. He had not been working late. He had not been handling investor relations. He had been elsewhere, living another life. The discovery did not break her. It clarified her. She had mourned the marriage already, not the man, but the illusion of partnership she had carried alone. This was simply evidence that grief had been justified. Still, one question remained. Why now? The answer came 3 days later. A journalist reached out, not aggressively, but carefully. She asked about a rumor circulating among certain media circles, a story being quietly prepared, a narrative positioning her as unstable, vindictive, unable to move on. The implication was clear. If the truth surfaced without her control, it would be weaponized. She ended the call politely and sat in silence. They were trying again. Different angle. Same objective. Discredit her. She could have buried the truth. Let it dissolve quietly. Protected her reputation by preserving the illusion of dignity. But she had learned something crucial. Silence did not protect the innocent. It empowered the manipulative. She chose transparency. Within 48 hours, her legal team issued a carefully worded statement, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual, confirming the existence of evidence uncovered during a broader investigation into financial misconduct, acknowledging personal betrayal without elaboration. No names, no details, just truth. The media reaction was immediate. Speculation exploded. Former allies of her ex-husband scrambled to distance themselves. Old interviews resurfaced, re-examined under a harsher lens. His past statements, once confident, now hollow, played in contrast to her restraint. And then came the apology. A public one. Too late. He released a statement expressing regret for personal decisions that caused pain, framing infidelity as a private matter, attempting to separate it from the professional damage already done. But the public no longer accepted separation. Patterns were visible now. That evening, she watched the news without sound captions scrolling across the screen. Analysts debated morality. Commentators speculated about motive. She turned it off. This wasn't about reputation anymore. It was about integrity. She met David Miller again a week later, this time at a quiet cafe away from glass towers and boardrooms. No urgency, no secrecy. "I thought you should know," she told him calmly. The truth came out. He nodded unsurprised. It usually does, eventually. They spoke briefly about accountability, about how often people confuse forgiveness with forgetting. When they parted, she felt no attachment, no unresolved emotion, just respect for honesty, however delayed. Back at the office, she made a decision that surprised even her inner circle. She initiated an internal audit, not because she suspected wrongdoing, but to prove there was none. Full transparency, voluntary oversight, a public declaration that her leadership would never mirror the secrecy that once betrayed her. Investors responded positively. Trust, once broken, rebuilt slowly, but it rebuilt stronger when anchored in action. Late one night, she stood alone in the office again, city lights reflecting against the glass like constellations. She thought of the woman she had been 6 months after giving birth. Exhausted, questioning herself, sensing something wrong, but convincing herself to endure. She wished she could reach back through time, not to warn her, but to tell her this: you survive this, and you become more than what tried to break you. She gathered the final documents and placed them into a sealed archive. Not hidden, not displayed, filed. The truth no longer needed to scream. It had already reshaped the ground beneath everyone's feet. And as she shut off the lights and walked into the night, she felt something rare. Peace, not because justice was loud, but because it was complete. The call came at 6:12 a.m., just as the city was beginning to stretch awake. David Miller's name glowed on the screen. She didn't answer immediately, not because she feared the conversation, but because she understood its weight. David didn't call without reason. He had learned that lesson the hard way. She answered on the third ring. "Good morning," she said evenly. "I wish it were," David replied. His voice was calm, but underneath it ran a tight wire of urgency. "I wouldn't call this early if it wasn't important." She sat up, already alert. "Talk to me. I've been contacted," he said, "by federal investigators. They're reopening something old, older than your case. And your name came up not as a suspect, but as a reference point." That caught her attention. "Explain." David didn't rush. "They're looking at a long-term pattern of corporate destabilization, hostile takeovers disguised as scandals. Your situation accelerated their timeline. What you exposed made them realize this wasn't isolated. She closed her eyes briefly. "So why me?" she asked. "Because David said you're the only one who fought back without burning everything down." They want to understand how. Silence followed, not empty, but thoughtful. This wasn't about reopening wounds. It was about precedent. "Have you agreed to speak?" she asked. "Yes," David replied. "But I told them I wouldn't do it without your knowledge or your consent." She appreciated that more than he likely realized. "Send me the details," she said. "I'll review them with counsel." An hour later, she was in her office, coffee untouched, documents spread across the table. The scope of the investigation was larger than she expected. Companies across industries, executives quietly ruined assets, absorbed by shadow entities, before anyone could connect the dots. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And she had been one movement in a much longer performance. By noon, her legal team confirmed what she already suspected: cooperating would not expose her to risk. On the contrary, it would cement her role as a credible voice in a system desperate for one. Still, credibility came with cost. By agreeing to speak, she would become visible again, scrutinized, interpreted, reduced to headlines that rarely captured truth. She weighed the decision carefully. Then she remembered the woman she had been when silence felt safer than conflict. She agreed. The interview was scheduled for the following week in a neutral building far from cameras. No press, no spectacle. David arrived early. He looked steadier than the last time she'd seen him, not lighter, but resolved, like someone who had finally decided which side of history he wanted to stand on. They spoke separately at first, then together. David told his part, how he'd seen patterns and chosen comfort over courage, how he'd convinced himself neutrality was harmless. She spoke of ownership, of how betrayal often hides behind familiarity, of how systems fail not because of a lack of rules, but because of selective enforcement. The investigators listened. They didn't interrupt, didn't challenge. They didn't need to. By the end of the session, the tone in the room had shifted. This was no longer theoretical. It was actionable. As they left the building, David exhaled deeply, like someone setting down a weight he'd carried too long. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me enough to do this together." She nodded. Truth works better when it's shared. That afternoon, a familiar unease crept in, not fear but anticipation. She knew visibility always triggered reaction. And she was right. 2 days later, an opinion piece appeared online, not naming her directly, but alluding heavily. Questioning motives, suggesting she was leveraging victimhood for influence. It was clumsy, transparent, and ineffective. The public response was swift and unexpectedly protective. Analysts dismantled the argument point by point. Comment sections filled with people recognizing the tactic for what it was, an old strategy trying to survive in a world that had grown less patient with manipulation. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. David texted her that night. They tried. It didn't work. She smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "It didn't." Weeks later, subpoenas were issued. Quietly, efficiently. The architecture of the network began to collapse from the inside, not through outrage, but through accountability. David was called again. So was she. Each time they spoke clearly, precisely, without embellishment. The story was writing itself now. One evening, after a long day, she stood alone on her balcony, city lights flickering below, like constellations rearranging themselves. She thought of how many times she'd been told to move on, to let go, to stop reopening the past. They were wrong. She hadn't reopened it. She had finished it. David Miller became something unexpected in her life. Not a reminder of what was lost, but proof of what could still be corrected. Not everything deserved forgiveness. But some things deserved accountability, even if it arrived late. As the wind brushed past her, she felt no anger, only clarity. The truth, once spoken, no longer belonged to anyone who could twist it. And for the first time since everything began, she knew this wasn't just her story anymore. It was a line being drawn. And she had helped draw it. Visibility has a price. It always does. She felt it the moment her name began appearing, not just in legal documents, but in conversations she wasn't part of. Boardrooms. She didn't enter private dinners where decisions were shaped by fear rather than fact. People spoke carefully now, choosing words like currency, weighing every association. Some reached out with admiration, thinly veiled as curiosity. Others retreated suddenly, too busy, their silence louder than any accusation. This was the cost of being seen clearly. It didn't scare her, but it narrowed her world. The company was thriving, yet the air around her felt sharper. Scrutiny had replaced suspicion, and while scrutiny was cleaner, it was no less exhausting. Every move was interpreted, every pause analyzed. She could feel it when she walked into rooms, attention sharpening conversations, adjusting their pitch. At night, she dreamed of corridors with glass walls, of walking forward while unseen eyes followed her from every angle, not threatening, just watching. She woke before dawn more often now. One morning, her chief of staff brought in a report she hadn't requested. A risk assessment compiled by an external consultancy, one she didn't remember hiring. "I didn't authorize this," she said, scanning the cover page. "They were hired by the board," her chief replied carefully. As a precaution against her. She didn't react immediately. She read every page. The language was clinical, but the implication was unmistakable. Her public profile, her cooperation with investigators, her refusal to stay quiet, these were framed as liabilities. Not illegal, just inconvenient. She closed the report and handed it back. "Schedule a board meeting," she said. "Today." The room was full when she arrived. Familiar faces, new expressions, polite tension threaded through the air like a held breath. She didn't sit. "I've read the assessment," she began, her voice steady. "I understand the concern. Let me be clear." She paused, not for effect, but to ensure her next words would land exactly where intended. "I will not apologize for transparency. I will not dilute my integrity to make anyone comfortable. And I will not lead from the shadows." Silence followed. She continued. "If the board believes my visibility is a risk, then we should discuss succession. Openly. Honestly. That did it." The suggestion cut through the room like a blade. No one wanted to be responsible for pushing her out. Not after everything, not with public trust so clearly on her side. One by one, objections softened. Clarifications followed. The risk assessment was reframed as due diligence. The conversation shifted. She sat then not because she'd been challenged, but because she had been heard. Afterward, David Miller called. "They're nervous," he said simply. "They should be," she replied. "Change always makes people nervous." David hesitated. "There's something else." She waited. "The investigation is expanding. They're offering immunity to minor players in exchange for testimony. Some names will surface, people you know." She absorbed that quietly. "Let them," she said. "Truth doesn't negotiate." Later that week, the first-name broken executive, once praised for ethics, now exposed for complicity. The news rippled outward, unsettling alliances, reshaping loyalties. She watched from a distance, refusing interviews, declining commentary. not because she feared backlash, but because she refused to perform. Power, she had learned, didn't need spectacle. But the pressure didn't stop. An anonymous blog post surfaced, weaving fragments of her story into something almost believable. It questioned her motives, her relationships, even her mental health during the months after childbirth. Old photographs were repurposed. Innocent moments twisted into implications. She didn't read the comments. Her legal team moved swiftly. Cease and desist letters, digital forensics, quiet takedowns. Still something lingered. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, lights off-city glowing beyond the window. She felt the familiar pull, the temptation to retreat, to shrink back into privacy, to choose peace over presence. Then she remembered something crucial. Peace that depends on silence is not peace. It is avoidance. The next morning, she did something unexpected. She wrote, not a statement, not a rebuttal, an essay. It was published in a respected journal, free of accusation, stripped of defensiveness. She wrote about visibility, not as privilege, but as responsibility, about how systems rely on exhaustion to silence those who disrupt them, about how truth doesn't need outrage, only persistence. She didn't mention names. She didn't mention herself. But everyone understood. The response was immediate and overwhelming, not viral, not sensational, thoughtful, enduring. It circulated quietly among leaders, policymakers, academics. It reframed the narrative without confronting it directly. David sent her a message that evening. You shifted the frame. She smiled. Yes, she replied. And I didn't have to shout. Weeks passed. The investigation deepened. The noise faded. The blog disappeared. The board grew steadier, recalibrating to a new normal, where integrity was no longer a liability. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, she paused by the window again. The reflection staring back at her looked tired, but unbroken, focused, grounded. She thought of the woman she'd been when invisibility felt like safety. She understood her now, but she didn't belong there anymore. Being seen had cost her comfort, sleep, simplicity, but it had given her something far greater, agency. And as she turned off the lights and stepped into the night, she knew this phase. This tension between presence and consequence was not a setback. It was a threshold. The subpoena arrived without warning. No dramatic knock. No flashing lights. Just an unmarked envelope delivered to her office, placed neatly on her desk by a courier who did not meet her eyes. It was addressed correctly, formally, respectfully. And yet the message was unmistakable. This was no longer about testimony. It was about accountability at scale. She read the document twice, then once more for precision. Her name was listed not as a target, but as a material witness with expanded scope. Financial decisions, governance timelines, internal communications. Years of records that would now be examined not just for wrongdoing, but for resilience under pressure. She felt no panic, only gravity. By midday, the office had shifted into quiet coordination. Legal counsel moved with practiced efficiency. Files were cataloged, servers mirrored, every action documented. Transparency was no longer a principle, it was protocol. Still, as the hours passed, she sensed something else taking shape beneath the logistics. A reckoning not of law, but of loyalty. People who had stood close during the crisis began recalibrating. Not fleeing, just adjusting their distance. Subtle changes, shorter emails, meetings rescheduled, invitations delayed. No betrayal, just self-preservation. She understood it. But understanding didn't soften the solitude. That evening, she met David Miller on neutral ground, a small public park tucked between glass towers and old brick buildings. No reporters, no microphones, Just benches and fading daylight. They're widening the net, David said quietly. Some people won't hold. She nodded. I know. You could step back, he added. Let the company appoint an interim lead. Reduce exposure. She looked at him, not sharply, but steadily. And let the narrative write itself, she asked. No. David didn't argue. He knew better. The truth was, she had already crossed the point of retreat. Stepping back now wouldn't protect her. It would suggest guilt where there was none. Visibility once claimed could not be borrowed. It had to be owned. The following weeks tested that resolve. Hearings followed interviews. Interviews became depositions. Each question was precise, layered with intent. She answered calmly, methodically. She did not embellish, did not speculate, did not defend beyond fact. Her restraint unsettled some. They were used to defensiveness, to emotional fractures, to leverage. She offered none. Outside commentary brewed. Analysts debated whether her cooperation was strategy or conviction. Critics whispered about ambition disguised as ethics. She didn't respond. Inside the company, fractures began to show. An executive resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Another requested extended leave. A third attempted to negotiate a severance package contingent on silence. She declined it. If people needed distance from integrity, they were free to take it without reward. One afternoon, a junior analyst requested a meeting. Young, nervous, bright. I just wanted to say, the analyst said carefully, I know this is hard. But watching how you're handling it, it matters. She didn't offer reassurance. She didn't minimize the difficulty. Thank you, she said simply. Just make sure you learn from it. Not everyone does. That night alone again, she opened the old journal, the one she had written in during the early aftermath. She hadn't touched it in months. She reread a single line she barely remembered writing. Survival is not the same as transformation. She closed the book. This pressure, this exposure, was transformation's final test. The fire that decides what remains. Then came the call she had been expecting and dreading. A former ally had agreed to testify, not against her, but around her. The implication was clear: proximity would be weaponized, context distorted, neutral actions reframed as complicit silence. Her legal team prepared her for the possibility of collateral damage. Reputations rarely fell cleanly. She listened, absorbed, then asked one question. What survives the fire? Her counsel hesitated. Those who don't try to outrun it. She nodded. When she took the stand days later, the room was packed, not with hostility, but anticipation. This was the moment everyone wanted to interpret. The expression, the hesitation, the flaw. She gave him nothing. She spoke with clarity, with patience, with ownership of decisions made and mistakes avoided. She acknowledged what she didn't know and refused to guess. There was no triumph in her voice, only truth. David watched from the back of the room. He recognized something few others did. This wasn't defense. It was authorship. By the end of the session, the tone had shifted. Questions lost their edge. The narrative bent not toward innocence, but credibility. Afterward, outside the building, cameras waited. She did not stop. She walked past them, steady, unguarded, unafraid. That night, she stood once more at her window, city alive. Beneath her, she felt tired, not from fear, but from endurance. And yet beneath the fatigue, something solid remained. Not anger, not pride, conviction. She had learned something the hard way. When everything burns, the reputation, the alliances, the illusions, what survives is not the image you protected. It's the truth you refuse to abandon. and she knew with quiet certainty that whatever came next, she would still be standing. The shift didn't announce itself with headlines or alarms. It arrived quietly, like pressure changing before a storm. She noticed it first in the questions. They were no longer probing for weakness. They were seeking understanding. During the next hearing, the panel leaned forward when she spoke. Notes were taken. Clarifications requested not as traps, but as invitations. The cadence of the room changed. Where suspicion once hovered, attention now settled, focus deliberate. This was the moment the world leaned in, not because she demanded it, because she had earned it. Outside the chamber, the atmosphere had softened too. Journalists who once circled for sound bites now asked for context. Analysts stopped framing her as a symbol and began discussing her decisions as precedent. The narrative matured, less spectacle, more substance. David Miller called that evening. "It's turning," he said. "They're listening now." She didn't smile. She knew better than to celebrate mid-flight. "Listening is fragile," she replied. "It depends on consistency." The next weeks tested that consistency in ways she hadn't anticipated. An internal memo leaked, old, innocuous, but stripped of context and framed as strategic manipulation. It spread fast enough to feel intentional. Commentators questioned her timing. Critics suggested orchestration. A familiar ache surfaced, the awareness that truth could still be bent even when clean. She gathered her team and addressed it head-on. "No denials," she said. "No counterattacks. We can textualize." They released the full document, set not just the memo, but the surrounding correspondence, the timestamps, the rationale. They trusted the audience to read. It worked. The noise didn't vanish, but it thinned. What remained was discernment. One afternoon, she received an invitation she hadn't expected, a closed-door roundtable with regulators, industry leaders, and policy architects. Not a hearing. A discussion she accepted. The room was austere, long table, muted lighting, faces shaped by years of cautious influence. She took her seat without ceremony. When asked to speak, she didn't posture. She talked about systems, about how opacity protects misconduct more effectively than malice ever could, about how organizations reward endurance over ethics, silence over integrity, about how transparency, when embedded structurally rather than theatrically, recalibrates power. She spoke of the postpartum months not as confession, but as context. How vulnerability is exploited not through force, but timing. How exhaustion creates openings that policy rarely accounts for. The room went still. This wasn't a personal story anymore. It was a framework. When the session ended, several participants lingered, not to congratulate, but to ask questions that mattered. Implementation, safeguards, oversight. David texted later, "You changed the language." She responded with a single word, "Good." But momentum brings pressure. The more she was invited to the table, the more her absence would have meant surrender. Travel increased, requests multiplied. Every yes carried consequence. She learned to say no without explanation. At night, the dreams returned, not of corridors this time, but of bridges, long spans stretching over dark water. She crossed them steadily, aware of the distance behind her, unconcerned with what waited ahead. One evening, she received a message she hadn't expected from a woman she didn't know. A stranger recently promoted navigating leadership in a system that had taught her to shrink. "I watched you testify," the message read. "It gave me language for something I couldn't name. Thank you." She didn't reply immediately. She sat with it. This quiet transfer of courage felt heavier than accolades. The investigation advanced. Indictments followed. Not loudly, methodically. The network unraveled in pieces, not spectacle. Accountability looked less like punishment and more like correction. Her role diminished as the machinery took over. And that too was a victory. One morning, standing in the elevator, she caught her reflection again. The fatigue was still there, but beneath it ease, a steadiness that hadn't existed before. She thought of the early days, of how every decision had felt like a defense, how survival had required vigilance. Now vigilance remained, but fear had loosened its grip. David joined her for coffee weeks later. No agenda, no updates. "You ever think about what comes after this?" he asked. She considered it. "Yes," she said, "but I'm not in a hurry." He nodded, understanding. "You don't seem driven by escape." "No," she replied. "I'm driven by alignment." As they parted, she felt something settle. This phase, this moment of collective attention would pass. It always did. What mattered was what stayed embedded after the gaze moved on. That night, she wrote again. Not in the old journal, but a new one. Not reflections, principles. Clarity over speed. Context over outrage. Structures over heroes. She closed the book and placed it beside the other. Not as a record of struggle, but as a map. The world had leaned in. Soon it would lean away. And when it did, she would remain grounded not in attention, but in the work that continued quietly long after the storm moved on. Silence returned the way it often does, disguised as relief. After months of scrutiny, the calls slowed. The requests thinned. The hearings concluded with procedural finality. Headlines moved on to fresher outrages. The world, having leaned in, leaned away again, satisfied it had witnessed enough. This was the dangerous part. She felt it the first morning she woke without an agenda prepared by someone else's urgency. No testimony to rehearse. No documents flagged for review. The quiet stretched longer than comfort allowed. She had learned by now that silence rarely meant resolution. It meant regrouping. At the office, operations hummed. The governance framework she'd helped architect functioned smoothly. Independent audits, rotating oversight decision logs, accessible to more than a privileged few. On paper, the system worked. In practice, people reverted quickly. Old habits resurfaced with subtlety. Closed-door meetings justified as efficiency. Informal channels reactivated under the guise of speed. Language softened where it once had sharpened interpretation, discretion, business judgment. None of it illegal. All of it familiar. She didn't confront it immediately. Instead, she watched, tracked patterns, noted who resisted transparency when no one was watching. David Miller noticed it too. "They're testing the perimeter," he said during a late call, "seeing how much of the old terrain they can reclaim." "Yes," she replied. "They always do." The final attempt came quietly, wrapped in reason. A proposal circulated among senior leadership, a revision to the governance charter. Narrow, technical, positioned as optimization. It would consolidate certain review powers under a single executive committee to reduce redundancy. Efficiency, they called it. She called it erosion. She requested a full session. The room was smaller this time. No press. No external observers. Just people who believed the storm had passed and the ground was theirs again. She listened as the proposal was presented, carefully worded, meticulously justified. Risk mitigation, competitive pressure, market demands. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't raise her voice. This change, she said, would move oversight from structure to trust. A pause. Trust is not a system, she continued. It is a condition, and conditions change. Someone countered politely. We're not eliminating oversight. We're streamlining. She nodded. Streamlining always sounds harmless. Until it isn't. The debate circled. Logic pressed against memory. People argued, not from malice, but fatigue. They wanted normalcy, back the old rhythm, where decisions moved fast, and accountability arrived late, if at all. She felt the weight of it then, not pressure from opposition, but from expectation. They wanted her to relent, to allow a compromise that felt reasonable and preserved her image as cooperative, not obstructive. She thought of the postpartum months, of how compromise had once felt like survival, of how reason had been used to justify her silence. She didn't hesitate. "I won't support this," she said, "and I won't remain in a structure that reintroduces the conditions we work to dismantle." The room went still. This was the moment silence tried one last time, not as absence, but as persuasion. The unspoken suggestion that stepping aside gracefully would preserve peace. She met it without flinching. "If this revision proceeds," she added, "I will resign from all operational roles and publish my reasons." Not as protest, as documentation. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. The proposal was withdrawn by the end of the meeting. Later that night, alone again, she felt the tremor settle in her chest. Not fear release. The kind that follows a decision made without compromise. David texted, "You didn't let them rewrite the ending." She replied, "Endings are overrated. I'm protecting the middle." The following weeks were quieter but cleaner. Conversations adjusted. Transparency regained footing, not because she demanded it, but because the alternative had been made visible. Still, something shifted inside her. She recognized the pattern now. Every system tests how much truth it can tolerate before attempting to bury it again. Silence, when it returns, is rarely innocent. She began planning her exit, not as retreat, but evolution. Not from responsibility, from singularity. She initiated a leadership transition, mentoring successors, decentralizing authority, embedding safeguards that didn't depend on her presence. The work mattered more than her role. David met her for coffee one morning and noticed the change. "You're letting go," he said. "I'm distributing," she corrected. "There's a difference." He smiled. "You've always known when to move." "Yes," she said softly. "I just didn't always trust myself to." One evening, she returned to the old house one final time. Not to reflect, she'd done enough of that, but to close a practical chapter. The sale was complete. The keys waited on the counter. She walked through the rooms without pause. No memories rose uninvited. The walls held nothing that belonged to her anymore. At the door, she hesitated not from longing, but recognition. This place had taught her the cost of silence. Outside, the air felt lighter. The city breathed. Life moved. She drove away without looking back. In the weeks that followed, her public presence diminished. She declined panels, passed opportunities to others, focused on architecture, not appearance. And yet her influence remained. Policies referenced her frameworks. Leaders quoted her language without attribution. Systems held not perfectly, but better. Silence returned again. This time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like space. One night, she stood on her balcony, city lights soft below. She thought of how often silence had tried to claim her story, first as erasure, then as compromise, then as persuasion. It had failed every time, because she had learned the difference between being quiet and being absent. Silence would always try, but she would never belong to it again. The courtroom was silent, in the way only places of final judgment ever are. Not peaceful. Never peaceful, but heavy, as if the air itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen. David Miller sat at the defense table, his posture straight, his hands folded calmly in front of him. To anyone who didn't know the story, he might have looked composed, even confident. But beneath that stillness was a man who had walked through betrayal, humiliation, loss, and truth, and had come out the other side changed forever. Across the aisle, the opposing side avoided his eyes. Months earlier, they had laughed at him. They had called him expendable. They had stripped him of position, reputation, and dignity, convinced he would disappear quietly. They never imagined he would return with evidence, witnesses, and a strategy so airtight that it left no room for escape. The judge adjusted her glasses and began to speak. She summarized the findings with clinical precision. Falsified contracts, forged signatures, financial manipulation, and deliberate attempts to shift blame onto David Miller. Each sentence landed like a hammer. With every word, the narrative that had once painted David as the villain collapsed further, revealing the truth underneath calculated greed, coordinated deceit, and a systematic effort to destroy one man to protect corrupt few. David didn't smile. This wasn't about triumph. It was about closure. When the verdict was read, the sound of breath leaving the room was almost audible. Guilty on all major counts, one by one. The people who had once controlled boardrooms and headlines now sat frozen, their future rewritten in a single moment. Careers were over. Reputations irreparably damaged. Some would face prison. Others would live the rest of their lives knowing that the truth had caught up with them, no matter how far they had tried to run. As the gavel came down, David felt something unexpected. Not joy, not relief, but release. For the first time in years, he was no longer carrying their weight. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Reporters shouted his name, desperate for a statement, a quote, a headline. David paused at the steps, sunlight washing over him like a quiet benediction. He turned not to the cameras, but to the people standing behind him, those who had believed him when it was costly to do so. His attorney gave a small nod. An old colleague once forced to testify against him under pressure mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." David acknowledged them all with the same calm grace. Then he faced the press. "I don't have much to say," he began, his voice steady, unshaken. "The truth doesn't need performance. It only needs time and evidence." That was all. He walked away as microphones strained to follow him. In the weeks that followed, the world rearranged itself. Companies restructured, boards dissolved. Investigations expanded far beyond what anyone had expected. David Miller's name, once dragged through the mud, was now spoken with respect, sometimes with awe, sometimes with regret by those who hadn't stood up sooner. Offers came in quickly: consulting roles, executive positions, invitations to reclaim everything he had lost, and more. David declined most of them. Instead, he did something no one predicted. He started over on his own terms. He invested in businesses that valued transparency over power. He mentored professionals who had been silenced by systems designed to protect the wrong people. He funded legal aid for those facing corporate retaliation without resources or voice. Quietly, deliberately, he became a kind of force that didn't dominate headlines, but changed lives. One evening, months later, David stood alone on the balcony of his apartment, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. The noise below was distant, muted. For the first time in a long while, his mind was quiet. He thought about the man he had been at the beginning of this story, trusting, loyal, blind to how easily loyalty can be exploited. He didn't resent that version of himself. He honored him. That man had believed in fairness even when the world had not. But this man, this version of David Miller, understood something deeper. Justice is not automatic. Truth does not always rise on its own. And dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you reclaim, piece by piece, when everything has been taken away. His phone buzzed with a message from someone he had helped recently. Because of you, they didn't give up. David stared at the words longer than he had any headline written about him. That was the real victory. Not the verdict. Not the apologies. Not the restored reputation. But the knowledge that his silence had turned into strength, his patience into precision, and his suffering into something that mattered. As the night air moved around him, David allowed himself a small, private smile. The story that began with injustice did not end with revenge. It ended with truth, freedom, and a man who finally belonged to himself again. And somewhere far behind him, the past closed its door for good. If part 14 was the reckoning, then part 15 was the aftermath, the quieter, deeper chapter that no courtroom would ever capture. Time moved forward as it always does, indifferent to verdicts and headlines. The world did not stop after justice was served. It simply adjusted. And in that adjustment, David Miller discovered that winning a battle did not automatically teach you how to live after it. In the months following the trial, David deliberately stayed out of the spotlight. He declined interviews, avoided conferences, and turned down speaking engagements that wanted to turn his suffering into inspiration sound bites. He understood something now that he hadn't before. Noise had once almost destroyed him. He would not invite it back. Instead, he focused on rebuilding a life that felt real. Every morning, he followed a routine that grounded him: early walks through quiet streets, black coffee without distractions, handwritten notes instead of emails. It wasn't nostalgia, it was discipline. After years of reacting to chaos, he needed structure that belonged to him alone. Yet, even in silence, his influence spread. The legal precedents set by his case were cited in boardrooms and courtrooms across the country. Compliance departments rewrote policies. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Executives who once believed power made them untouchable suddenly realized how fragile their positions really were. David never claimed credit, but people knew. One afternoon, he received an invitation that surprised him, not from a corporation, but from a small nonprofit coalition of former employees who had been forced out after refusing to participate in unethical practices. They didn't ask him for money. They asked him for guidance. So David showed up. He sat with them in a modest conference room, no cameras, no press. He listened more than he spoke. He learned their stories, some eerily similar to his own, others even harsher. Careers ended overnight. Families strained under financial pressure. Mental health fractured under the weight of injustice. When it was his turn to speak, David didn't give a speech. He told the truth. "I didn't survive this because I was fearless," he said. "I survived because I was methodical. Fear doesn't disqualify you. Panic does." He taught them how to document, how to protect themselves legally, how to move slowly when others rush, how to choose timing over emotion. He didn't promise victory. He promised clarity. That became his role, not a hero, not a symbol, but a guide. Meanwhile, his personal life underwent a transformation just as profound. David had lost relationships during the darkest years, friends who distanced themselves, connections that faded when his reputation was questioned. At first, he felt the absence sharply. But over time, he recognized a difficult truth. Not all losses were tragedies. Some were filters. The people who returned after the truth came out did so cautiously, often with explanations. David accepted some apologies, Others he acknowledged without reopening doors. Forgiveness, he learned, did not require access. New relationships formed quietly, honest ones. People who knew his story but didn't center it, who respected his boundaries, who didn't confuse resilience with invulnerability. One evening over dinner with someone who knew him only as he was now, David realized something subtle but powerful. He was no longer defined by what had been done to him. He was defined by what he chose to do next. Years passed. The world moved on to new scandals, new villains, new narratives. David Miller's case became a reference point, then a chapter, then history. That didn't bother him. In fact, it relieved him. Stories are meant to end so lives can continue. His work expanded quietly. He helped fund an independent ethics review board. He supported legal clinics that specialized in corporate retaliation cases. He invested in startups that built transparency into their structures from day one. He never sought control. He insisted on safeguards. When asked why, his answer was simple: power needs friction or it becomes dangerous. On the anniversary of the verdict, David did something symbolic, but only for himself. He returned to the courthouse, not inside, just the steps. He stood there for a moment, remembering the weight he had carried walking out that day, the uncertainty, the relief, the exhaustion. He realized now that closure hadn't come from the verdict itself, but from what he had done afterward, choosing integrity even when no one was watching. As he turned to leave, a young man approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me," the man said. "You're David Miller, right?" David nodded. "I just wanted to say, your case made me document everything before speaking up at my company. It saved me." David felt the familiar quiet tightening in his chest, not pain but gravity. "I'm glad," he said simply. That was enough. Later that night, alone in his apartment, David reflected on the long arc of the story that had once consumed him. It had begun with betrayal, escalated into public humiliation, and nearly ended in erasure. But that wasn't the full truth anymore. The real story wasn't about what they did to him. It was about what he refused to become because of it. He hadn't turned bitter. He hadn't sought revenge disguised as justice. He hadn't rebuilt the same systems that had crushed him just with his name on top. He had chosen restraint, precision, purpose. And in doing so, he had built something quieter, stronger, and far more enduring than power. Legacy. Not the kind etched into headlines, but the kind carried forward in decisions made by people who never met him, but benefited from the path he cleared. As David turned off the lights and prepared for rest, the past no longer whispered accusations or doubts. It sat where it belonged, behind him resolved. The story that began with injustice ended not with dominance, but with dignity. Not with noise, but with meaning. And for David Miller, that was the truest form of victory. Some stories don't teach us how to win. They teach us how to survive without losing ourselves. David Miller's journey reminds us that betrayal doesn't just break trust. It tests identity. When the people or systems you believed in turn against you, the real danger isn't the loss of reputation or security. It's the temptation to become smaller, harder, or crueler, just to protect yourself. True strength isn't proven by how loudly you fight back, but by how deliberately you choose who you remain when everything is trying to reshape you. This story shows that justice is not always immediate, and healing is never linear. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you comfort, certainty, and even relationships. But integrity, once compromised, is almost impossible to rebuild. David didn't win because he was powerful. He won because he was patient, disciplined, and unwilling to trade his values for short-term relief. Most importantly, this story reminds us that closure doesn't come from revenge. It comes from clarity, from knowing that even when the truth was inconvenient, you honored it. That even when silence would have been easier, you chose accountability. And that even when the world misunderstood you, you didn't abandon yourself. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. What would you protect if everything you built was suddenly questioned? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if stories like this move you, inspire you, or help you feel less alone, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful real-life stories.